The summer air in Memphis was heavy, thick with the smell of gasoline and fried food drifting from the corner diner. A crowd lingered near the curb, waiting, when a modest Lincoln pulled up, its paint dulled, its body plain. Behind the wheel sat the most famous man in America, Elvis Presley. Not in a gleaming Cadillac, not trailed by guards or cameras, just Elvis, alone, dressed simply, looking more like a neighbor than a king. For a moment, silence gripped the street. The king of rock and roll, in a car that looked older than the decade. Some whispered in awe, others just stared. And then it came. The laughter. Loud, cutting, theatrical. A wealthy local businessman stepped forward, cigar in hand, voice booming for all to hear. "Well, would you look at that? That's your king? Can't even afford a decent ride." The sound of laughter rolled through parts of the crowd, sharp and cruel. Some joined in nervously, others lowered their eyes, ashamed. The words hit harder than anyone expected, like a slap across the face of the man who had once electrified the world. Elvis didn't fire back. He didn't shout or argue. He only turned his head, fixing the man with a steady look. No anger, no defense, just a quiet, unflinching gaze. Then he pressed the gas, the old car pulling away slowly as the crowd split between mockery and stunned silence. In that moment, the humiliation didn't just belong to him, it belonged to every soul watching. Because somehow, it felt like all of them had just been mocked with him. Let us know where you're watching from. And we hope you enjoy the story. The late afternoon sun hung low over Memphis, casting a warm haze over the street. People had gathered, as they often did when word spread that Elvis Presley might be in town. He wasn't behind the wheel of his glittering Cadillac this time, nor stepping out of a limousine that screamed of Hollywood polish. No, this evening he had chosen something far more modest, almost startling in its plainness. An old, slightly faded automobile that still bore the scars of years of use. The paint was dull, the chrome had lost its sheen, and compared to the glittering cars lined up outside the cafe where he stopped, it looked like a relic out of place in the hands of the most famous entertainer on the planet. The crowd that had gathered wasn't hostile, at first. They were curious, excited, whispering as he parked and stepped out. Elvis, in a casual jacket and dark sunglasses, looked relaxed, almost unguarded. For many, that was the thrill. To see him not on stage, not under the blinding lights, but simply as a man moving through his hometown. For a few minutes, that was all there was. Gasps of recognition, children craning their necks, mothers nudging their sons, and a few young girls nearly fainting at the sight of him. Then came the laugh. It rose sharp and cutting above the softer sounds of admiration, slicing through the atmosphere like a knife. A portly man in a tailored suit stood by the cafe entrance, cigar in hand, his voice carrying with theatrical exaggeration. "Well, would you look at that?" he boomed. "The great Elvis Presley, the king himself, rolling up in something that looks like it belongs in a junkyard." The crowd's mood shifted instantly. A ripple of uneasy laughter followed the man's words. It wasn't everyone. Some remained quiet, uncomfortable, but in public, even hesitation becomes complicit. A few businessmen nearby chuckled, their eyes darting between Elvis and the loud man, as if trying to decide whether it was safe to join in. And when the man laughed again, louder, that laughter spread, gathering force like a cruel tide. The contrast was brutal. Just moments before, Elvis had been met with admiration, his presence treated with reverence. Now, the same people who gazed at him with awe allowed themselves a nervous snicker, as though the shine of his stardom could be dimmed by a rusty car. Journalists, never far from a Presley sighting, had their pens out. Notebooks flipped open, a camera clicked, and one could almost hear the headlines being drafted in their minds. Elvis, cheap car, big laughs. It was the kind of story tabloids devoured. Proof, perhaps, that the king wasn't always draped in velvet and diamonds, that he could be mocked like anyone else. But Elvis did not storm off. He did not lash back or defend himself with words that could later be twisted into tomorrow's scandal. Instead, he paused, removed his sunglasses, and let his eyes sweep the crowd. There was no fire in them, no flare of anger. What lingered there instead was a curious blend of patience and irony, as though he recognized the absurd theater unfolding before him. He raised an eyebrow almost imperceptibly, and for those close enough to see, there was even the faintest hint of amusement tugging at the corner of his mouth. The wealthy man expected rage, or at least embarrassment. Instead, Elvis's silence turned the tables. The crowd grew quieter, laughter trailing into an awkward hush. People shifted uneasily, suddenly aware of their own complicity in the mockery. The moment was poised on a knife's edge, and then, out of nowhere, came a voice that didn't belong to the critics or the adults. A boy, no older than 13, pushed his way to the front. His hair was messy, his shirt too big, and his sneakers bore the marks of a kid who spent more time running the streets than worrying about polish. His eyes, though, were wide with admiration. He looked at Elvis, not at the car, and shouted in a voice that cracked with excitement, "Hey, Mr. Presley, your car's awesome!" The words hung in the air, disarming in their sincerity. The boy's grin was genuine, unfiltered, untouched by the smug irony that had filled the space a moment before. And just like that, the tension cracked. Elvis crouched slightly, meeting the boy's gaze with a warmth that wasn't rehearsed. He asked the boy his name, leaned closer to hear his reply, and exchanged a few quiet words that no one else could quite catch. For those watching, it was unmistakable. Elvis had chosen to give his attention not to the rich man puffing on his cigar, but to a child who saw value where others saw only ridicule. The wealthy man's laughter sputtered, caught in his throat. For the first time, the power of the moment slipped from his grip. The crowd, too, shifted again, this time toward the boy's perspective. Murmurs of approval rose, people smiled at the sight, and suddenly the old car seemed less like a joke and more like a symbol, a reminder that greatness wasn't measured in polished chrome. Elvis placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder, said something that made the child beam, then stood upright again. He didn't look back at the suited man. He didn't need to. The point had been made, not through defiance or anger, but through grace. As he walked toward the cafe, the journalists scribbled furiously. Some still thought they had a story of mockery, but others now recognized the twist, that Presley had handled the insult not by escalating it, but by redirecting it, making dignity itself into his shield. And deep in the eyes of those who truly admired him, there flickered something more enduring than laughter. Respect. For Elvis Presley, the evening had not ended in humiliation. It had begun as one, but in choosing to kneel to a boy instead of bending to mockery, he transformed it into something else entirely. A moment that would not fade into cheap ink on paper, but echo quietly in the memory of everyone who had been there. The house was quiet when he returned. Graceland, usually buzzing with the noise of friends, staff, and the restless energy of visitors, seemed wrapped in a hush that mirrored his own mood. The air outside carried the faint scent of magnolias, heavy in the Memphis night, while inside the lamps cast soft golden pools of light across the living room. Elvis slipped off his jacket and tossed it carelessly over the arm of a chair, his movements unhurried, yet tinged with something unsettled. A few members of his inner circle, the so-called Memphis Mafia, were scattered around the room. Some lounged on the couches, half watching television without much attention. Others nursed drinks, speaking in low voices. When Elvis entered, they quieted instinctively. They could read his face. He wasn't storming, but neither was he the buoyant, joking figure they were used to. He went straight to the piano in the corner, the old Steinway, whose polished keys had borne witness to countless midnight sessions. Without a word, he sat down, pressed a few scattered chords, and let his fingers wander into a slow, bluesy improvisation. The notes filled the silence, rising and falling with a melancholy lilt that spoke more than words could. No one dared interrupt him at first. They knew that when he sat like this, head bowed, body swaying gently with the rhythm, he was working something out that couldn't be said aloud. Finally, one of them, Red West, leaned forward. "Rough evening?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. Elvis didn't stop playing. His voice, when it came, was quiet, even. "Funny thing, Red. You can sing to thousands, hear them scream your name like you're the center of the universe, and then one man with a cigar laughs at your car, and suddenly it sticks to you like tar." The room stayed silent. The men there had seen him face adoring crowds, but they'd also seen him shrink inward at moments of small cruelty. Fame didn't erase old wounds. It only gave them new shapes. He kept playing, notes cascading like fragments of memory. "When I was a kid," he said slowly, "we didn't even have a car. Daddy had to borrow rides when he could, and sometimes we walked half the night just to get where we were going. I remember standing on the side of the road, praying somebody would stop, and when they didn't, I swore I'd never forget that feeling." He paused, the music softening into a fragile pattern of chords. "So, for me, it doesn't matter if it's an old beater or the shiniest Cadillac. Every car I've ever driven was already a victory." The words carried a weight that settled over the room. It wasn't self-pity. It was remembrance, raw and unvarnished. Those who had grown up with more didn't always understand how deep the scars of poverty ran. But for Elvis, the memory was never far away, no matter how gilded the walls around him. Another of his friends, Marty Lacker, tried to lighten the air. "Well, you could have reminded that fat cat you've got more cars in your garage than he's got hairs on his head." That drew a faint smile from Elvis, the corners of his mouth twitching with amusement. But he shook his head. "That'd just make it worse. He wanted me angry. I'm not giving him that." From the couch, Sonny West piped up with a grin. "Then why not flip it? Show him what a real car looks like. Hell, tomorrow you ought to roll up in one of your Cadillacs and leave him eating dust." The room chuckled at the thought, but the suggestion hung there longer than intended. Elvis stopped playing and looked up, his eyes glinting with something unspoken. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rose from the piano bench and walked out of the room. The men exchanged looks. They knew that expression, quiet, thoughtful, carrying the promise of some idea forming beneath the surface. A few seconds later, they heard the back door open and close, then the distant echo of footsteps on the gravel drive. He made his way to the garage. It was late now, the moon casting a pale light over the rows of vehicles inside. Elvis flipped the switch, and the fluorescents flickered to life, illuminating a lineup that any collector would envy. Cadillacs in every shade, sleek sports cars, even the odd motorcycle gleaming under covers. For him, they weren't trophies but indulgences, each one representing a little piece of the dream he had chased since boyhood. He walked slowly between them, his fingers brushing the smooth surfaces, pausing at a jet-black Cadillac, then a deep blue convertible. Finally, He stopped before a white Fleetwood, its paint glistening like ivory under the lights. It wasn't the flashiest, nor the rarest, but there was something about its clean lines, its dignified presence, that caught his eye. He stood there for a long while, hands in his pockets, just staring. Then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled. The gesture was faint, but it held conviction. Back in the house, the others waited, whispering speculations. Was he brooding? Planning a comeback line? They didn't know. But when Elvis returned, his expression was calmer, his eyes steadier. He sat again at the piano, pressed a gentle chord, and said softly, "Sometimes the best answer isn't in words." No one pressed further. They didn't need to. Whatever plan was forming in his mind, it would reveal itself soon enough. The night lingered on. Some of the men drifted away to sleep. Others stayed nearby, half dozing. But Elvis remained at the piano, lost in thought and music, his fingers tracing out melodies that seemed both mournful and strangely resolute. The humiliation of earlier still hovered in the air, but it no longer looked like a wound. It was becoming something else, fuel for a gesture that none of them could yet imagine. And somewhere deep in the garage, that white Cadillac seemed to wait in silence, as if it already knew it would play its part in the story that was only beginning to unfold. Dawn crept softly over Memphis, washing the streets in muted tones of gray before the first light of sun began to gild the rooftops. The wealthy man, the same one whose laughter had cut through the crowd the evening before, rose early as was his habit. He liked being the first to step outside, cigar already lit, surveying his manicured lawn like a king inspecting his domain. His house, large but not extravagant by the standards of true Southern aristocracy, sat on a quiet avenue where neighbors watched each other's comings and goings with discreet interest. This morning promised nothing unusual until he opened his front gate. At first, he thought his eyes deceived him. Parked directly in front of his home, gleaming in the fresh morning light, was a brand-new Cadillac Fleetwood, white as porcelain, its chrome shining so brightly it almost blinded him. The tires still bore the scent of new rubber, the body so polished that the rising sun mirrored off its surface in sharp brilliance. For a man accustomed to wealth, the sight of a new Cadillac wasn't shocking in itself, but the placement, the timing, the sheer theatricality of its appearance at his doorstep. It froze him in place. Beside the car stood a courier in a pressed uniform holding a neat envelope. When the man approached, the courier extended the letter with a formal bow of his head. "Delivery for you, sir," he said simply. The businessman accepted it with trembling fingers. He glanced at the envelope, noting the familiar handwriting scrawled across the front. "To the gentleman who found laughter yesterday." He opened it carefully. Inside was a single card, on which a few lines had been written in Elvis's unmistakable hand. "Maybe this one will suit your taste better. Perhaps now you'll find someone else to laugh at. Elvis." No flourish, no signature beyond the name itself. Just irony, edged with kindness. The man's cigar drooped slightly in his mouth. His face flushed, not with triumph but with something closer to panic. He turned toward the street, hoping no one had noticed. But it was too late. The rumble of voices rose behind him. Neighbors had already begun to gather. A woman in her robe stood with her husband across the street, whispering. Two young men from the next block leaned against a lamp-post, pointing at the Cadillac with grins. A group of children darted up the sidewalk, marveling at the sparkling car as if it were a spaceship. "What's all this about?" one man called. "Is that yours?" The wealthy businessman attempted a laugh, loud but brittle. "Well, I suppose it is now," he declared, puffing his chest. "Perks of friendship with the king, you might say." but his words fell flat. The crowd wasn't laughing with him this time. They studied his flushed face, his awkward attempt to own the moment, and they saw the truth written in his forced smile. This wasn't friendship. This was theater, one in which he had been cast, without choice, as the butt of the joke. The courier, sensing the shift, gave a polite nod and departed, leaving the Cadillac keys dangling in the man's hand. He stood motionless, trapped between pride and humiliation, while the neighbors murmured in awe, not of him, but of Elvis. By noon, the story had already traveled across the city. Memphis was no stranger to Presley legends, but this tale carried a peculiar charm. People repeated it in barbershops, over diner counters, in factory break rooms. "Did you hear? Elvis gave a Cadillac to that fellow who mocked his old car." Each retelling sharpened the irony. The man who laughed at another's vehicle now had one he hadn't earned, handed to him by the very person he tried to belittle. Reporters caught wind quickly. By the afternoon edition, the headline stretched across the paper: "Presley gives businessman brand new Cadillac." Photographers scrambled to capture the car outside the man's home, while columnists debated the meaning. Some painted it as a practical joke, others as an act of outrageous generosity. But the story was irresistible either way. The businessman, meanwhile, could not escape the stares. When he tried to drive the Cadillac down Main Street, people honked and waved, but not at him. They shouted Elvis's name as though the car itself carried the singer's aura. At stoplights, strangers leaned from their windows and asked, "Is it true? He gave that to you?" The man would nod stiffly, but no explanation satisfied. His authority, once unquestioned in his circles of wealth, seemed suddenly fragile. Back in Graceland, Elvis heard the news from one of his aides. He listened without comment, strumming absently on his guitar. When pressed, he only smiled. "Let them print what they like," he said softly. "The man's got his car. I've got my piece." But the truth was deeper. Elvis knew the story would spread beyond the neighborhood, beyond Memphis, perhaps across the nation. Yet he hadn't done it for the papers. He had done it because dignity demanded a response, not through anger or revenge, but through a gesture that no one could erase or belittle. For the boy who had defended his old car the night before, this was proof that Elvis cared more about honor than pride. For the neighbors who watched the Cadillac delivered, it was a lesson in grace. And for the man who once laughed so loudly, it was a reminder that sometimes the sharpest humiliation comes not from being attacked, but from being outshined by unexpected generosity. The Cadillac remained parked outside his house for days, its white paint gleaming like a monument. And every time he looked at it, the man couldn't help but hear the echo of his own laughter. The sound that had started it all, now twisted into something hollow, something that mocked him instead. What began as a cheap insult had transformed into legend overnight. And Memphis, buzzing with whispers and headlines, understood what the man himself had yet to admit. Elvis Presley had won the exchange without ever raising his voice. The city of Memphis woke to headlines that carried more weight than most morning news. On newsstands and cafe counters, the bold print shouted variations of the same story. Elvis Presley gifts a Cadillac to the man who mocked him. It was the kind of tale that sold papers faster than baseball scores or political scandals. At the editorial offices of the Commercial Appeal, reporters argued over tone. Some insisted the gesture was a jest, Elvis getting the last laugh. Others claimed it was an act of Southern chivalry, a public reminder that even mockery would not shake his generosity. The debate grew heated enough to rattle typewriters. Should the city remember this as a prank or as a display of dignity? Meanwhile, smaller publications smelled blood. Columnists who had scribbled notes the night of the humiliation, the ones preparing to run with Elvis Arrives in Rusty Relic, were now shredding drafts and rewriting. What could have been a tale of embarrassment had inverted overnight. Suddenly, they weren't chronicling the fall of a king, but his quiet, unexpected triumph. Out on the streets, the story moved faster than the presses. At barber shops, men leaned forward in their chairs as the barbers repeated it, scissors snipping in rhythm to their retelling. At the corner diner, waitresses carried plates of eggs and grits, while relaying the news to truckers over steaming cups of coffee. On factory floors, workers passed the word during smoke breaks. "You hear about Presley?" someone would start. "The Cadillac story?" another replied. And then they'd shake their heads in disbelief, grinning. Some saw it as poetic justice. Others framed it as proof of Elvis's big heart. But no matter the angle, everyone agreed on one thing. Nobody else could have turned humiliation into legend with such grace. Journalists searching for more depth stumbled across an unexpected detail. One reporter, chasing leads, found the boy who had spoken up during the original insult, the teenager who had shouted, "Your car's awesome, Mr. Presley." His family lived in a modest neighborhood, a few blocks away from where the scene had unfolded. When the reporter asked him what he thought of the Cadillac story, the boy's answer was simple, almost disarmingly pure. "For me," he said, "he's the king no matter what car he drives. Doesn't make a difference." That single line became its own headline. "For me, he's always the king. On any car." It spread like wildfire. The innocence of the boy's statement, contrasted against the arrogance of the businessman, struck a chord. Readers clipped the article, repeated the words, and in those few sentences, Elvis's dignity became undeniable. The businessman, meanwhile, struggled. The Cadillac in his driveway drew constant attention, but not the kind he had hoped. Neighbors paused to stare. Some admired the car, yes, but with every comment came the question that cut him deeper. "So Elvis gave you this, huh?" The emphasis was always on Elvis, never on him. At his club downtown, where he had once held sway with booming laughter and boasts, the mood had shifted. Associates raised their glasses to Elvis's generosity, not to his own influence. A few even teased lightly. "Careful what you say around Presley. You might come home with another car." What was meant as humor felt like a knife, and the rumors only grew. People whispered that Elvis was known to hand out Cadillacs left and right, to friends, to strangers, even to those who didn't like him. Stories surfaced of gas station attendants receiving keys, of nurses surprised with cars after a kind word. Whether all were true or not hardly mattered. They added fuel to the myth. The idea that Elvis could answer cruelty with a gift instead of spite turned him from entertainer into something more symbolic. By the end of the week, the narrative had solidified. In homes across Memphis, people told the story not as gossip, but as parable. Parents repeated it to their children as a lesson in grace. "See, son, you don't fight fire with fire. Look at what Elvis did." For journalists, the tone of coverage had shifted entirely. Where the first draft of history might have painted him as the butt of a joke, the rewritten version etched him as magnanimous, larger than his critics, untouchable not because of wealth or fame, but because of how he carried himself. And so, what began as one man's attempt to belittle Elvis had turned into something that reshaped public opinion. In coffee shops and boardrooms, in gossip circles and church pews, Elvis Presley's name was spoken not with pity, but with reverence. The Cadillac itself became more than a car. To some, it was a gleaming symbol of irony. To others, a monument to Presley's ability to rise above insult. For the businessman, It was a daily reminder that his attempt at mockery had backfired into legend. But for the people of Memphis, it was a story that belonged to them too, a tale of their native son showing the world, once again, that grace could cut sharper than ridicule. And from that moment forward, whenever they saw Elvis driving down Union Avenue, whether in an old car or a Cadillac fresh from the dealer, they no longer measured him by the shine of the chrome. They measured him by the strength of his dignity. Evening draped itself over Graceland with the hush of a weary lullaby. The house, so often a hive of voices and laughter, seemed unusually subdued. Inside the living room, the lamps glowed dimly, the patterned curtains drawn against the fading light. Elvis sat in his favorite armchair, with a guitar resting across his lap. He strummed absently, the sound quiet, more like a heartbeat than a song. A few of his closest companions were gathered nearby, men who had seen him at his highest peaks and his darkest valleys. They spoke little, sensing his mood. The story of the Cadillac had swept across Memphis and beyond, painting him once more as a man of near mythic grace. But here, in the sanctuary of his home, the triumph didn't rest easily on his shoulders. Elvis's eyes drifted toward the fireplace, unfocused. He plucked a few chords, then let them fade into silence. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and even. "They're all talking about that car. The papers, the radio, even folks I ain't never met. But that's not why I did it. I didn't care about teaching that man a lesson. I just didn't want to meet hate with more of the same." The room stayed still. A dog padded across the floor and settled at his feet, and he absent-mindedly scratched behind its ears. "But you know what bothers me," he continued, "that people measure me like that. By Cadillacs, by houses, by how shiny something looks. That ain't who I am. That ain't why I sing." His words hung heavy, more confession than complaint. For a man crowned in rhinestones on stage, Elvis felt the weight of being misunderstood more acutely than most. His friends knew he craved recognition not for spectacle, but for sincerity. Yet the world rarely separated the two. Red West leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "EP, you've been proving people wrong your whole life. When we were kids, nobody thought you'd get out of Tupelo. You remember those days, patching up old clothes, hoping for bus fare. You never forgot. That's why you hand out cars, why you give money away. You're trying to make sure nobody feels the way you felt." Elvis gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He nodded, acknowledging the truth, then shifted his gaze back to the guitar strings. He strummed a few bars of a gospel tune, soft and unfinished. Sonny West, sitting off to the side, added gently, "What you did with that Cadillac, that was about more than a car. It showed everybody you're bigger than insults, but you don't have to carry the world on your back every time someone laughs." Elvis stopped playing and looked at them both. For a moment his expression was unreadable. Then his lips curved into a wry half-smile. "Maybe I'm the fool, thinking one gesture could make people see the truth. Maybe I need to remind them. Not with cars, not with gifts. With the music." The tone in his voice shifted, carrying a conviction that caught everyone's attention. His hand stilled on the guitar, but his eyes sharpened, alive with a flicker of resolve. "You know," he said slowly, "I didn't start all this to own a garage full of Cadillacs. I sang because the songs came from somewhere deep, from Mama's hymns, from the blues down on Beale Street, from the ache of wanting more than we had. Every note I ever sang came from that little boy who didn't even have lunch money half the time. Somewhere along the way, folks forgot. Maybe I forgot too." His voice faltered, softer now, edged with something almost like fear. What if I've lost it? What if people don't hear the heart anymore? Just the costumes, the cars, the spectacle. The silence that followed was thick. His friends shifted uneasily, each sensing the rawness in his words. Elvis Presley, idol of millions, who could silence a stadium with a glance, sat before them confessing the quiet dread that fame had hollowed out his truth. Charlie Hodge, his longtime confidant, finally spoke. "EP, you're still that boy from Tupelo. You never left him behind. That's why people still line up for miles just to hear you sing. They don't come for the Cadillac. They come because when you open your mouth, they hear something real. Don't forget that." Elvis exhaled slowly, setting the guitar aside. He leaned back, his face shadowed by the lamplight. "I guess I just need to remind myself," he said quietly. "And maybe remind them too." For the rest of the evening, he sat without playing another note, lost in thought. The conversation drifted among the men, light jokes, half-hearted laughter. But Elvis remained withdrawn. His mind was elsewhere, circling around the Cadillac, the laughter, the headlines, and the boyhood memories that never quite let him go. When he finally rose to leave the room, he paused at the doorway. His voice, soft but firm, reached back to them. "The world can laugh at my car, or cheer at my Cadillac. But I know the truth. My songs were never about either. They were about the soul. And maybe it's time I showed that again." He disappeared up the staircase, leaving his friends in silence. They had seen him wear the crown of celebrity, but tonight they had seen something rarer. The heart of the man beneath it, wrestling with doubts no Cadillac could ever ease. The Cadillac had been sitting in the man's driveway for several days, gleaming like an accusation. What should have been a prize felt instead like a spotlight that refused to dim. Every time he walked outside, he felt the weight of his neighbor's stares. Every time he turned the ignition and the powerful engine roared to life, he caught the smirks of passers-by who knew the story. At first, he tried to pretend it was a mark of his stature, that he, a respected businessman, had been gifted by Elvis Presley. But beneath the bravado, his pride twisted painfully. He could sense what others thought, that he had been humbled, outshone by generosity he couldn't match. And the whispers followed him everywhere. By the fifth day, sleepless and restless, he made a decision. He would face Presley directly. That morning he climbed into the Cadillac. The new leather interior still smelled rich, but instead of bringing pleasure, it churned his stomach. His hands trembled slightly on the wheel as he guided the car through the streets of Memphis. The city seemed to watch him. Every turn of the road, every red light, every group of onlookers seemed aware of his shame. When he reached the gates of Graceland, he hesitated. The ornate iron gates, adorned with musical notes, stood tall and unyielding, flanked by fans lingering in hope of a glimpse. Some recognized the car instantly. Fingers pointed, voices rose. "That's the Cadillac." The man's cheeks burned as he pulled closer to the guard booth. The security guard approached, cautious. "Morning. Business?" The man swallowed, forcing his voice steady. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Presley. Tell him it's about the car." The guard eyed him for a moment, then disappeared inside the booth. A few tense minutes later, the gates swung open. The man drove up the long driveway, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Each turn of the wheels felt heavier, as though the car itself resisted being there. Elvis was waiting on the porch. Dressed casually in a dark shirt and slacks, he stood with his arms folded loosely, his expression calm. He didn't look amused or angry, just steady, as though he had already imagined this meeting would come. The Cadillac rolled to a stop, The businessman stepped out, his suit jacket clinging in the humid air. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Finally, the man cleared his throat. "Mr. Presley, I came to—" He faltered. The words lodged in his throat. He tried again. "I came to thank you. And to apologize." Elvis tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You don't owe me thanks," he said softly. "And apology. That's up to you." The man's composure wavered, his face flushed, his hands clenched. For years he had been the loudest voice in the room, the one others deferred to. Now he stood before a man younger than himself, unable to string a sentence together. "I shouldn't have mocked you," he said at last, his voice rough. "It was cheap. I thought it was funny. But it wasn't. Not to you. Not to anyone." Elvis stepped down from the porch, closing the distance. He spoke gently, without a trace of triumph. "You know, when I was a kid, people laughed plenty. At my clothes, at my accent, at the way I looked. I know what that feels like. I wasn't about to pass it along." The businessman looked at him, surprised. He had expected sarcasm, maybe a lesson dressed in cutting wit. Instead, he found compassion. "I didn't give you that Cadillac to make you feel small," Elvis continued. "I gave it because I could. Because sometimes the only way to answer cruelty is with kindness. Otherwise, the hate just keeps circling." The words struck harder than any rebuke. The man's throat tightened. For the first time in years, he felt something he rarely allowed himself: humility. "I don't deserve it," he admitted quietly, glancing at the gleaming car. "Not the gift. Not your grace." Elvis laid a hand on his shoulder, firm but kind. "Maybe not, but none of us deserve half the blessings we get. Take it anyway. Maybe it'll remind you that pride don't have to be louder than decency." The man blinked, struggling to hold back the rush of emotion. For a long moment, the two stood there, one weighed down by shame, the other offering dignity without demand. When at last the man turned to leave, he felt lighter, though no less chastened. Driving the Cadillac down the driveway, he realized the car no longer felt like a monument to humiliation. It felt like a responsibility, an unspoken charge to live differently. Back on the porch, Elvis watched him go. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He simply stood, quiet, knowing the moment had been bigger than either of them. He had faced down insult not with anger, but with empathy, and in doing so, had planted a seed that might grow into something more lasting than any headline. The Cadillac's engine faded into the distance, but the silence that remained at Graceland felt profound. Elvis turned and stepped back inside, the weight of the encounter pressing gently on him. He hadn't set out to change the man, but perhaps, just perhaps, he had. Weeks passed, and the storm of gossip slowly settled into memory. The Cadillac still gleamed in the businessman's driveway, but something in him had shifted. The man who once strutted through downtown with his chest puffed now walked with quieter steps. In his circles, he no longer boasted about his wealth, no longer made easy sport of belittling others. It was as if Elvis's gesture had pressed upon him a mirror too sharp to ignore. He began showing up at church not in the front pew with an air of authority, but sitting in the middle rows, anonymous. He donated money quietly to local charities, not with a press release, but with his name absent from the lists. People noticed, though he never explained. Some suspected guilt. Others whispered that Presley had humbled him beyond repair. The truth lay somewhere in between. He had been changed, not by humiliation alone, but by the mercy woven into it. One evening, The businessman found himself holding 2 tickets to an Elvis concert. He hadn't sought them out. They had been offered by an acquaintance, and something inside urged him not to decline. The night of the show, he arrived early. The auditorium buzzed with energy, alive with the chatter of thousands. Lights shimmered overhead, instruments gleamed on stage, and the air thrummed with anticipation. He took his seat quietly among strangers, blending into the sea of faces. No one recognized him, or if they did, they gave no sign. When the house lights dimmed and the crowd erupted, he felt the swell of energy wash over him. Elvis appeared, dressed in a dazzling suit, his presence filling the hall before he even sang a note. The band struck up, the audience roared, and yet beneath the spectacle, the businessman felt something unexpected: humility. He watched as Elvis moved through the set, each song delivered with a force that reached past rhinestones and stagecraft into something elemental. The man found himself listening differently now, not to the performer he once mocked, but to the human voice behind the music. Midway through the concert, Elvis slowed the tempo. The stage lights softened, the crowd quieted, and he began a ballad, low, tender, carrying the ache of memory and longing. In the stillness, the businessman felt his throat tighten. He thought of that night outside the cafe, of his cruel laughter ringing over the crowd, of the boy who had defended Elvis's car, of the Cadillac delivered to his home like a challenge he could never dismiss. For the first time, he clapped not out of politeness or social expectation, but with genuine admiration. His palms stung with the force of it. When the song ended, his eyes were wet. Around him, strangers cheered, oblivious to the depth of what the moment meant for him. Elvis looked out over the crowd, scanning the faces. Perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps intuition, but his eyes lingered for a heartbeat on the man in the middle rows. A flicker of recognition crossed his features, not of triumph, but of acknowledgement. He offered the smallest of smiles, so fleeting it could have been missed. Yet the man felt it pierce straight through him, a silent exchange that needed no words. In that instant, the Cadillac ceased to be a burden. It became a symbol of grace undeserved, of a chance to be better. He understood, finally, that Elvis had not silenced him with wealth, but invited him to silence himself through reflection. After the concert, as the crowd spilled into the night air, the man walked slowly to his car. The Cadillac waited under the streetlights, its white paint glowing softly. He ran a hand along the door, not with pride, but with something akin to reverence. For him, it was no longer just an automobile. It was a reminder, permanent and humbling, of the lesson he had been forced to learn: that true power does not come from mocking others, nor from flaunting possessions, but from the quiet strength of mercy. Back at Graceland, Elvis ended the night as he often did, alone with his thoughts. He hadn't sought the man in the crowd, but when he saw him, he recognized what the moment meant. He leaned against the window, looking out over the dark Memphis sky, and whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, "Kindness always goes deeper." The world would continue to tell the story of the Cadillac. Some would frame it as a clever retort, others as an extravagant joke. But for the man who had once laughed the loudest, and for those few who knew the full truth, the ending was different. It was not about cars, nor even about Elvis's fame. It was about a man learning, perhaps too late in life, but still in time, that dignity answers cruelty more powerfully than revenge ever could. And in that revelation, something inside him shifted forever. For Elvis, it was never about winning. It was about being true to the boy from Tupelo, who had once known poverty, ridicule, and the sting of small cruelties, and who swore never to pass that pain forward. And for the city of Memphis, the story settled into legend, retold in barber shops, in churches, in whispers across generations, how Elvis Presley turned laughter meant to wound into a lesson in grace. The Cadillac still gleamed on quiet streets, but its shine no longer mocked anyone. It reminded all who saw it of something far greater, the simple, unshakable truth that kindness leaves the deepest mark.